Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
And I'm here today with Coco Krumme, who is an applied mathematician and also an author. And her book is entitled Optimal Illusions, the False Promise of Optimization. Welcome, Coco.
Thank you, Greg. Glad to be here.
Now, look, this book, I have to confess that I am one of your targets. Optimization is kind of my bread and butter. And whether you're teaching economics or data science or operations or finance or all the topics that I teach in business school, I mean, they're really all about optimization. And I hadn't really given a lot of thought to how pervasive this way of thinking is as sort of an operating system for the modern world. And you talk about optimization as a method, right? I mean, obviously, I remember back when I first learned linear programming and I was like, wow, this is so cool, right? So there's a method, but it's also a language and it's also a mindset. And so in the book, you talk about how pervasive it is, but also how attempts to escape the trap of optimization leads you down a road of more optimization in many cases. And so we'll have to talk about that. But maybe we can start off by just saying, what do you really mean by optimization? Because it seems like the term, you attack it from a lot of different angles, and it seems like a really hard thing to define. I mean, if you define it so broadly as to say, hey, we want a lot of good stuff and we don't want a lot of bad stuff, I mean, it's kind of hard to object when you put it that way.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, right? And I think part of what became clear to me after writing the book, I didn't necessarily go in with this intent, but I think feels a little bit like this faceted sphere, right? This idea of optimization. And I do have a lot of different perspectives on it. And I'm speaking with people in the book who have, they see this one facet. It's like the blind men touching the elephant, right? And so I think you're absolutely right that there's the narrow technical definition that you probably encountered in school or in teaching, as did many of your listeners. And then, there's another facet that's sort of this broader Western engineer's mindset, right? Of progress and ever upward, ever better. And then within that, there are sort of these micro facets as well, that have to do with particular systems and how they've been optimized. So absolutely, there are a lot of ways to look at it. I do think it, as sort of a zeitgeist, it's not this big bucket that encompasses everything, right? It actually has a fairly narrow set of associated implications.
Well, right. I mean, you're an applied mathematician, and so I'm presuming that, when you first started using the term optimization, you were using it in the context of some constrained mathematical problems, right?
I think I encountered it actually before then. I tell the story in the book of, my sister chiding me on being too much of an optimizer, in the context of, we were wandering around and I was trying to plot out the best route from one place to another. And I think she probably drew the term from the fact that both of our parents are engineers, and my mother specifically, has a doctorate in operations research. So I do think these kinds of terms or this way of thinking was certainly in the water as we were growing up.
So she was probably channeling Herb Simon in some way, right? And presumably offering an alternative way of doing things, which would be what he called satisficing, right? And I found in the book an interesting discussion about how, satisficing or, applying some optimal stopping rule on the road to optimization is in itself kind of something that lives within the language of optimization. Um, so was she thinking maybe that you ought to be more of a satisficer when she made that critique?
Well, I think she was critiquing me as as siblings do, without a necessarily a solution in mind. But uh, you know, I actually think she didn't have the idea of satisficing, excuse me, in mind. Um, I think she was simply saying, as any normal person would, right? We're in this beautiful place. We've got the whole afternoon without any constraints or anything to do. Just relax. And I think that was a moment at which it struck me that, you know, this idea of trying to pack things in and, not waste time, not waste any extra steps by going, not optimizing the traveling salesman's route throughout a town you're just hanging out in for the afternoon. That's sort of this foreign idea to not optimize. And, granted, this was 20 years ago. And even then it was, um, this is, I say even then because I think the advent of digital technologies has, at least in our personal lives, made the idea of personal optimization all the more salient and all the more common. But even 20 years ago, it was something that we defaulted to as a way of organizing our time and organizing the world.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, look, if a company is optimizing, that's one thing, but when individuals sort of apply this to their individual lives, that seems like something very different. I sometimes caution my MBA students, and I say, hey, listen, when I hear you talking about your children as durable goods, then I get a little concerned, right? When you start talking about, going long your boyfriend, or short your boyfriend, I get a little worried. So, I mean, is there, should we be thinking about the application of optimization methods at the personal level differently than at some systems level? I mean, are there different kinds of pathologies that we need to worry about more at the personal level?
That's a great question. I mean, I think, of course, the two are related, right? Your MBA students are going on to to work in these corporations and run them. The very corporations that champion optimization in their company's business. And it's not surprising to me that those terms would then bleed over to one's personal life. And I think even the corporations are responsible for this, right? If you're running your HR department in an optimized way, you're going to think of people as resources, and you're going to think about what amenities you can provide that will give you the best return on investment, so to speak. So I think, and of course, it's often couched in much more humane language. I give the example of Zappos in the book that was, a company very good at, is a company very good at optimization. Um, and that, couched some of their techniques of optimization in these very user-friendly kind of humane terms. And well, I think it's a double-edged sword, right? We can argue that actually, if you are optimizing for customer satisfaction or employee happiness, those aren't in and of themselves bad things, right? Um,
Yeah, what could
but
possibly be wrong with that? I mean, if you want to optimize, world peace, right? Or, optimize. I mean, I guess people would say, the critics are saying that maybe you're pursuing the wrong goal, or maybe you've mischaracterized the constraints, or you failed to, measure the trade-offs accurately. And so that
Mhm.
if there's a problem, the problem is not with the methodology, but with the components that of the model, right?
Right, and that's the typical economist's response, right? It's like, well, it's nothing wrong with optimizing. It's a framework, right? And when we want the best, we acknowledge that maybe a model might not capture everything perfectly, so we can tweak the parameters, we can think about externalities, we can collect data in a different way. And again, I think I want to be clear that I'm not against optimization per se, right? This isn't a manifesto to stop optimizing. Um, I simply think we're unaware of how pervasive this way of thinking has become, and we're unaware of its implications and its trade-offs.
Yeah. So, I mean, in order to evaluate this way of thinking, we need to introduce some alternatives. And so, what would the alternative look like, right? I'm not trying to maximize the good stuff, right? I'm not going to acknowledge constraints. Like, what would, to a person who is steeped in this methodology, it's hard to imagine an alternative way of doing things that doesn't seem in some ways dysfunctional.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I think that's exactly why it's both so pervasive and we feel this certain insecurity with it, or unhappiness, right? Is that we can't, within the limits or the bounds of an optimizer's mindset, it's very difficult to think of other ways, right? We can optimize for, as we just discussed, we can change our objective function and optimize for something else, right? We can tweak our model. We can decide, like Herb Simon suggests, that we're not going to find the global maxima, but we're going to be satisfied with some local, um, some local alternative, local maxima. Um, and so, yeah, I think, you've hit the nail on the head. That's exactly the issue. And, if you look at it from the perspective of a culture or an ideology that's not so steeped in optimization, it seems like a silly question to begin with, because there exist other organizing principles for the world that have nothing to do with optimization, and they're grounded, in some kind of um, greater reality, or greater, belief system that's inherited through culture, religion, generations, and not questioned often. Um, and I think part of our modern unhappiness is that all we have is optimization, and we are able to question it, right? We are able to say, well, maybe it should be working better, and then, where do we reach to if we don't have those um, that alternative of a cultural or religious mooring that's been passed on for generations.
Well, I mean, I think you mentioned malaise, right? You mentioned, you acknowledge that there's sort of a contemporary malaise, and it may have something to do with this mindset. But you also point out that this idea of optimization does have sort of religious and ethical roots, right? Whether it be with utilitarianism of John Stuart Mill and James Mill, right? Or the, Protestant notion that, one should be frugal and efficient and so forth. So it seems like there was sort of a unfulfilled promise. I mean, do some people find sort of fulfillment in the pursuit of optimization, right? Or is this sort of something which ultimately will lead to some disappointment and malaise in all of its practitioners?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think you're right to point to that argument. Excuse me. Um, in the book, that I do think it has, I would say, cultural more than, explicitly religious roots, but and in certain ways it's become our own religion. I guess I was distinguishing it from sort of more, um let's say, um, more um, non engineer driven or sort of indigenous forms of culture and religion, um, insofar as it's become a very heady thing, right? And we are, because it's a heady thing, that allows us to question it, and I think that's at the root of the malaise. Um, you just asked another question about, is everybody doomed to be an optimizer, or are there happy optimizers? I think was your question,
Yeah,
and
yeah. I
I
mean, I guess the question is, there you've identified a malaise, and I think a lot of people, certainly in contemporary America, do feel some kind of malaise and are wondering kind of where it's coming from. And but I wonder, are there people that don't, right? I mean, you talk about Sam Altman, right? I mean, there,
Mhm.
particularly in Silicon Valley, it seems like these folks don't seem to have any problem, right, emotional or intellectual, with these frameworks and methods as a way
Yeah,
of life.
yeah. I mean, we could talk about that particular subclass, which I think is fascinating. I think to start by answering your question more broadly, I'm sure you see this in MBA students, or just in sort of in local ways, right? I think optimization can work quite well, right? I think of like the personal optimization movement with fitness and diet and so on and so forth. And um, I would say those people, I wouldn't choose that kind of hyper tracked lifestyle, but the people I talk to in those kinds of movements are actually, pretty happy. They're or seem to be, right?
Mhm.
They're making progress. They're building muscle. They're, doing their fasting at different times of the day and eating their various pills and, potions. Um, so I do think, uh, in small ways, or in sort of local, these microcosms, there are ways to enjoy optimization, right? It's a game. And you could see progress, and I think that's a something humans enjoy. We like seeing ourselves, or seeing the world get better. I do think it's pathological at the kind of Silicon Valley elite level. And I, um, I think there are varying degrees in to which these different people that you mentioned and beyond, right, actually, to what extent that belief in optimization is, very deeply rooted versus a uh, an intellectual exercise, of kind of posturing to um, justify whatever investments they're making or whatever success they've had. It's a very curious thing, and I do feel like in the last however many years, I'd be curious what you think as well, but maybe 5 years or so, um, we've as a general population have become more skeptical of those kinds of techno utopian um, proclamations.
Yeah, it's hard to know when you live in the bubble, right? And
Mhm.
you've moved around and spent a big chunk of your life in the Bay Area and Silicon Valley, and then also in MIT, and now you are in a more rural area. Um, and I was wondering, I mean, is part of what you are critiquing quantification, right? Because I mean, it does seem as if it's difficult to do optimization without some form of quantification, right? You have to reduce things to a metric, right, that can be compared across different options. And so is part of the corrosive um, process of what you call optimization really quantification? Is that also sort of a sub theme of your critique?
Yeah, I break things. Thanks for queuing this up. Break optimization into a few sort of necessary requirements or components, and one of them is quantification, or specifically atomization of the world into seeing things in terms of self-same units that can be tallied up. The other two sort of buckets of necessary requirements that I see are abstraction, right? In order to optimize, we need to be able to think in terms of models and, with these atomized units as building blocks, what structures are we building? Um, and the third is automation, which is it's a popular, or it's a term on the tip of many tongues these days. Um, but to optimize, we need to be able to scale those abstractions up in kind of a hands-off way. Um, so, I do think quantification and optimization are certainly related. You can quantify without optimizing, though, right? You could simply
Mhm.
count things up without seeking to improve or make things better.
Well, but it seems also that if you're going to have an objective function, then
Mhm.
right, it has to be a single, there has to be a single metric, right? And
Mhm.
so everything has to be reduced to a single metric, and you can't have irreconcilable objectives, right? You can't say,
Mhm.
well, I've got these two different goals and I can't talk about the trade-offs. It forces you to I mean, that's sort of the beauty of it, right? That it forces
Mhm.
you to articulate the trade-offs between your different goals and objectives. And so, what are the consequences of that in terms of how one engages in the world, right? Just forcing. I remember having a conversation with somebody where I was saying it's absolutely essential that you know the value of your time, right? So that you can
Mhm.
decide whether you're going to drive or take Uber, whether you're going to do this
Mhm.
or that. And they said, well, the minute you put a dollar figure on your time, then all of a sudden, when you're spending time with your family, you're thinking, oh, this cost me, $100 or whatever. I mean, is it the reductionism of optimization that is part of the problem?
Um, yeah, I think, as you point out, it can be very useful in certain ways, right? If a business didn't have um, a, a way to track over years, how well it's doing, how much, let's say, they associate how well they're doing with how much they're selling, um, it would be a very messy business. And um, I I think it becomes problematic with a business or in your personal life, right? When this metric um, creates blinders. So if you are monomaniacally focused on increasing revenues, um, there are other parts of your business that are maybe harder to measure or aren't measured in dollars
Mhm.
that tend to become neglected. Um, and yeah, I think in your personal life, the example you give is a great one. Um, I think it is poisonous to begin thinking about family time in terms of dollars per hour, right? And it's there's so many um, implications of that it's like, okay, well, then do you just hire somebody to substitute you
Mhm.
for your family time at a lower hourly rate? um, so
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, because some people would say, look, optimization is not a choice. The choice is whether you're doing it kind of explicitly or implicitly. I mean, if you listen to animal behavior people, they'll say, well, if you examine a worm is optimizing, a crab is optimizing, a bird is optimizing, everybody's optimizing them and you can't avoid it. The question is whether or not you're doing it explicitly or not, right? So, I'm teaching a bunch of doctors right now, and a lot of them will say, well, you can't put a dollar figure on a human life, and it's like, well, you're doing it anyway, right? Like every time you decide to spend money on this versus that, you're doing it. And so the economists would say, well, look, if you're going to do it, you should do it out in the open so that you endorse it. But I think something's lost when you do it out in the open, right?
Yeah,
Is
and I'm going to even push back on your assumption there, right? That everybody's optimizing. I think as optimizers, we see the worm and the bird optimizing, but is that really what they're doing? That's the metaphor we apply to them. That's we can build models around where the bird, how the bird forages for worms and or seeds or whatever, and the see optimal or optimized patterns. Now is the bird, you know, and then the animal behaviorists who are steeped in like modern neuroscience would tell you, well, their brains are, optimizing in this way, and all organisms are built, through the optimization of the Darwinistic optimization of evolution. Now that, like that's one way of looking at it for sure.
Well, it's
Um,
tautological, right? I mean, that's the thing.
exactly.
It's the you reverse engineer the objective function, right? By through tautology.
Yeah, and I think it's indicative of this is our driving metaphor. Is the bird does the bird believe it's a computer? Probably not.
Mhm.
Does the bird have its own, you know, belief system that that drives how it forages? Who knows? Um, but certainly I think that's become, I wouldn't say trendy, but it's become sort of a pervasive, prevailing metaphor that that our brains work like um, machines, right? It's simply it's a dominant metaphor of the day. Um, and then I've forgotten the where that assumption led for you,
Well,
or
I
the
guess,
question.
yeah. No, the question is, right, if how explicit should one be? I mean, if one
Hmm.
has values and one has goals, I think
Right.
a lot of economists would say make them explicit, right? If a
Hmm.
system is engaging in trade-offs, right, let's make it explicit and make sure that this really is what you want to be doing, right?
Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah, and you
so,
use the doctor example, right?
yeah.
I mean, I'm curious if you were teaching them, what would you tell them? It's my feeling that I'd ask the same question of the doctors that I would of the bird, right? Are the doctors really um in their day to day? And I know a doctor or two, and I don't think they're necessarily thinking with that
No, I don't think,
lens.
yeah, I don't think they are.
Um,
That would be but I think some people would say that they should be, right? So they should be
Yeah,
aware.
certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and certainly the medical system and the sort of industrialized, increasingly industrialized insurance and medical systems are pushing them in that direction, right? With shorter, away from holistic care towards shorter visits, everything's tracked, and everything's measured, and then if you're, not sufficiently optimized, um, there's potentially a lawsuit, right?
Mhm.
Or at minimum, the McKinsey consultants come in and, make changes to your software system or your, hospital layout so that you can increase whatever metric they're tracking.
Mhm.
Um, So I don't know in terms of I think making it explicit um is I understand your argument, right? You might as well, because if it's implicit, um it's it's hidden and um more subject to abuse or sort of faulty logic in optimizing or whatever the risks are. Once it's explicit though, then that's when you do that's when everybody's talking about it and everybody's tracking, and that's where the McKinsey consultants make their billions, right? Is it's out in the open. Everybody can see what's suboptimal, so they can come in and optimize things.
Now,
Um,
among the things that you say are lost includes slack,
mhm,
place, and scale. And I think your discussion of farming, you spend a bunch of time on
mhm.
agriculture and farming, and you use that as sort of a microcosm of how people have lost that connection to the land. People have lost connection to their food, and that the supply chains have gotten fairly brittle as a result of this. Um, what would an alternative world look like in that domain?
Yeah, I mean, um, I think a lot of people have imagined alternatives, right? I'm not, I don't, my activist streak is is underdeveloped in this case, to have a very strong perspective on what it should look like. I'm definitely a critic of what does exist now, because I think it's broken, both in ways that are very obviously measurable and ways that are more, let's say qualitative. Um, so I think, this is one of the difficulties I discuss with de-optimizing, right? If we decide, if we're in agreement that a system isn't working, one alternative, as we've discussed, is to look for ways to further optimize it. Um, Another is to look at systematic ways to be happy with, these local maxima per Herb Simon. Um, and another alternative is to um, de-optimize, or make things less efficient, right? And that's where it gets tricky because there are many ways to, if you're at the summit of a mountain, right? There's only one summit, but there are many ways down the hill, right, that lead to different parts of the geography below. And so in the case of agriculture, right, do we want to go back to a state in which, you know, half the population is farming? Um, Probably not. Many people, at least in this country, would argue that's not what a um, modern America that they envision looks like. Do we want to go back to a state in which 1 out of 10 people farms? Maybe, there are many ways to kind of envision um, the future if we're using this optimizer's mindset to de-optimize.
Yeah, but isn't that just sort of saying there's an optimal amount of inefficiency in the system, right? An optimal amount
Yeah, and
of
I think
slack in the system.
that's how a lot of people look at it. And I suppose my alternative, to the extent that I have one, is it's not a specific proposal, but an entreaty to look at things through, not solely through the lens of optimization, right? What are um, the some of the values or the principles we want to begin with, not the values we want to optimize, because
Mhm.
that's quite dangerous, I think, if we're optimizing for certain values. But what are, as individuals and as communities, what are the values and principles we begin with and we hold as we um, build or rethink certain systems?
Mhm. Well, you talk about some currents and trends where people are trying to, resist some aspects of this technological utopianism, right? And you talk about people that are, downloading apps in order to use their phone less, right?
Hmm.
And you talk about Marie Kondo, right, who is decluttering, but she seems to, in the process of decluttering, she seems to be maximizing right the joy that she gets from her stuff. I mean, it seems like it's almost impossible to engage in resistance without simultaneously acting in service of the frameworks that you describe.
Yeah, no, I think it's very tricky, right? I think, it's I'm sometimes accused of being a Luddite, which I don't think is a perfectly fair description. I think the Luddites were um
So the Luddite would just get rid of the phone rather
right, and
than
moreover, I
downloading an
think
app to regulate their usage of the phone,
yeah,
right?
Luddites were pretty punk rock too, right? They there was some burning down of things, if I understand the history correctly. And I'm not, at least like the materially, physically advocating for burning down of things, although, and I don't think even intellectually, um, I think that's number one, very difficult right now. And um, number two, I don't know that I don't know that's the right approach, right? The equivalent of that today would be to be, completely off the grid. And which I think is in modern America is actually quite difficult, right? It's,
Hmm.
there's a lot of off grid kind of LARPing that happens with, then you look and there's actually tanks of propane and, fiber internet and all kinds of other things that allow a comfortable existence with just merely without being um, connected to the electrical grid. So to truly be a hermit in the woods is quite difficult these days. And I think it's a choice for, a very, very small, or that's um, acceptable and attractive to a very, very small percentage of the population. So I do think that's sort of the struggle that as modern Westerners, right, we face for the next number of years is we're aware that some of these ways of thinking and these systems, they're failing, both the material in the material world and in our intellectual spiritual world. We don't feel happy. We're we feel we're going too fast. We feel we've lost track of some of the important things. And I think the question that we face is how do we continue to live in the modern world, right? And with its with its many conveniences and its the many fruits of optimization, um, and at the same time expand our ways of seeing that world and of being in that world, and expand our belief systems and our way of knowing, um, to hopefully a place where we we feel more at ease in it.
Well, I mean, you use this metaphor of kind of islands and railroads, right? Islands being connected by railroads, and I mean, it seems to suggest that maybe there's a complementarity between the sophistication, the technology, right, the optimization, and the attempts to kind of resist it or check out of it. I mean, I'm thinking, I have a 40-year-old car, not a single microprocessor on this thing, right? No software.
What kind of car?
It's a old Mercedes uh,
Cool.
diesel. But
Mhm.
I want my mechanic to have digital records. I want to know, like, when was the last time I had the brake change and so forth. Or, I go to a butcher that is all humane, local, no antibiotics and all that stuff. But I want to make sure that they've got a nice refrigerated supply chain to get this stuff to efficiently to the butcher shop, right? I mean, are there kind of complementarities? I mean, I talked to a number of farmers who operate in farmers markets, and they said, well, it would have been completely uneconomical for them to be a small scale farmer if they didn't also have all this great technology, right, that enabled them to arrange their uh, weekend visits to the farmers market and so forth. So I mean, is there something about sort of keeping things in their boxes and being very selective about how one engages in technology? Um,
Mm,
can
well,
technology make it technology and optimization make it easier and more cost effective to check out and be sort of a moderate Luddite?
a moderate Luddite, a satisficing Luddite satisficer. Well, first of all, I would argue that the things keeping those farmers at the San Francisco Bay Area farmers market in business are not so much whatever apps they have to organize their inventory, but rather the fact that their technology, the last 20 years of Silicon Valley technology has created incredible wealth in the Bay Area that allows people to pay for, you know, pristinely locally grown goods at these farmers markets. So I think that's you know, happily for the farmers and also sadly for the world in insofar as like not that's a extreme luxury for most consumers and most farmers to operate that way. That I think that's what's keeping them in business. I um, I don't know if there's a way to separate, right? The I think of like a local animal husbander here in a small rural place and um yes, now um there are certain regulations you need to follow for the USDA about how you slaughter your animals and how you package and distribute and um I I don't know that those are a bad thing. It- but they are an extra hurdle um and probably overkill for, if you're butchering a lamb for people who live within a 3 mile radius. You may not need refrigeration. You probably don't. Um, so yeah, I don't know how to answer uh, that question. I think it really um, the elements of optimization we accept into our lives, right, they're very case dependent.
Mhm.
And I agree with you that they can be helpful in in many ways, and they're helpful shortcuts, right? If you are buying meat that's traveled a long distance, like you said, you want that assurance that it hasn't been left to spoil on a railroad car and frozen and defrosted 17
Mhm.
times.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, the language of optimization has moved from the world of engineering into the world of the personal. What would it look like for a non-optimizer to, what would that look like if that language was incorporated into one's personal life? I mean, how do you live? I mean, how does one go about living in a way where one isn't continuously thinking about
Yeah. I mean,
optimizing?
I wouldn't, again, for the record, I I consider myself still an optimizer. I mean, I'm still steeped in that mindset. And I think it's for me, and I think for increasingly for a lot of people um these days, it, I see sort of these small things that are about kind of um relaxing some of these um, demands of optimization or relaxing one's engagement in them. And I think when you begin to see this more when you are in or I began to see it more, I should say, outside of the a fast-paced, the fast-paced Bay Area, where you have the opportunity to have things on demand, right? And I think even there, I tried to resist that as much as possible, right? With not taking these on-demand car services and trying to walk and even, take the bus when I didn't want to walk. Um, but I think you see it even more in communities that haven't adopted all of, many of these optimizations. Um, and you see that it's quite possible and even enjoyable to live without them. Um, and so I think that's a small step I see kind of trending or a lot of people moving in that direction of voluntarily giving up some of these shortcuts, whether it's um, having a smartphone or having all these apps or allowing one's work to pervade every moment and corner of their lives. And I think from those kind of material changes, um, that's sort of where the seeds to new ways, new frameworks or metaphors for understanding the world come to arise when you aren't kind of as much part of this churning, optimizing world. You start to see, well, there are other people have other interesting ways of, you know, organizing the world or thinking about, how they make decisions, or even building businesses, right? Um, anyway, that's how I see it happening.
Yeah. You had this one phrase in the book where you said something about how if you focus on the pattern, then you miss out on the observation. And I was wondering if you could kind of dig into that, right? Because I think of it as models are incredibly powerful and incredibly useful, but if you put too much weight on them, then yeah, you miss out on anomalies and you miss out on the particular.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, is this true for? I mean, if this is true for models in general, then it wouldn't just be true for models that are optimizing, right? If there is such a thing as a non-optimizing model,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, no, I think that's the case. I mean, I'm somebody who loves models as ways of understanding the world.
Mhm.
And I think it's as with any, whether it's a mathematical model or a philosophy or you're at the market looking for apples, right? Everything you're going to see is this an apple? Yes or no, right? um, so they do organize um, our world, and I think that's a reality, and it's a beautiful reality, and I think if we're at the supermarket not looking for anything in particular, we're going to notice a lot more things than just whether this item is an apple or not.
Mhm. Right. And so what do you think is do you think that we're going to see an increase in kind of you know, what malaise? Do you think that there's going to be sort of a flourishing of different sorts of movements that might lead to some increase in checking out, as you call it, right? Checking out of the modern world to some
Yeah,
degree.
or opting out. Yeah, I
Yeah.
I, I don't know. I think we're in a fascinating time in human history. I mean, I would guess that anybody who's paying attention in their own time probably feels that way too, but or has felt that way. But I I think we have to reconcile with the last 4 years, right? We had this unprecedented for modern times pandemic that and I'm referring not so much to the virus itself, but the um, behavioral and cultural
Mhm.
changes that and even physical travel pattern
Yeah.
changes
And
that.
the work that you did for the book took place during that time frame.
Right. Yeah, which was an interesting time to be doing. I mean, I've been thinking about this idea for, many years before that, but I think I was doing the writing at this convergence of a couple of things. One is this quite sudden like loss of faith in big tech that I think started around 2018 or so. But certainly when I was contemplating the book originally, it was before that time, and people thought I was a little bit nuts to um, even be questioning some of these great new technologies that were going to make our world, an ever more perfect place. And then the pandemic, and I think the thing that we really still have to reconcile with is it caused um, this moment, this collective moment of rethinking, right? Around what is the work I'm doing? How am I doing that work? Who is my community, right? What is what is my family, like spending, there were suddenly people in America who went from spending a few hours a week with their families to to spending all day with their families, and that caused all kinds of rethinking, um and around it, I think there was this opening for rethinking a lot of our systems and a lot of the work that we do, and seeing, maybe we are very reliant on these supply chains that don't always, um, deliver the goods in 48 hours as with the click of a button, because things break down. Um, and now we're in this weird place a few years later where things have gone back to quote unquote normal. And I think there was, at least in my mind, that I was expecting or waiting for some kind of big shift. And I think a
Mhm.
lot of people were. And now we've gone back to quote unquote normal with the knowledge, and that feeling that there was a big shift that was kind of on the verge of happening or possible, and yet we haven't seen it, which I think is very disconcerting to people. So um, I think that's something we're going to have to reconcile with. I mean, this is tangentially related to optimization, but I think the axis of that um, change that we didn't, is sort of a window of time, right? The axis is from, it's on the spectrum of optimal versus not, right?
Well, there have been moments, right, in history. I mean, you mentioned the Luddites, right? But there's
Mhm.
also kind of the anarchists, and then sort of in the 60s, they even used
Mhm.
that term, right, putting sand in the gears, right? And
Mhm.
people were saying, but they all seem to be sort of, hiccups or speed bumps on on the way to this uh, world of technological sophistication. Is 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 this something that's inevitable on a social scale? I mean, is it
I mean, I'm not a
is
historian, but I think I think even to see that reflects the the optimizer's mindset, right? To see history as the time since the Enlightenment, where everything that set us back from this promise of progress is a hiccup, right? I think that's the historian as as optimizer, who's looking back and seeing that, or the optimizer as historian, I should say, right? I think if you take a different time window of human history, we might see our era as a hiccup, you know, where we were worshiping at the altar of progress and digital technologies, and certainly that's been the case for several hundred years, but not for a very large chunk of
Mhm.
of human history. So I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine, like, um, I'm not one of these burn it all down people. Um, it, it's I guess I was going to say it's hard for me to imagine that kind of future, but it's actually quite simple because that's what the Hollywood movies are. It's the apocalypse movies are all about, when it all burns down, and I find that kind of vision entertaining, if not entirely believable. Um, So I don't know. What do you think comes next?
Well, I don't know, but I do know that it's very difficult as an individual to opt out of many of the
Mhm.
phenomenon that you describe, right? Because and you described this farmer who tried to um, resist the use of GMO crops and realized that it's really almost impossible for individuals to to opt out, right? And so it ultimately requires more coordinated action. Well, Coco, thank you so much for joining me. This book is called Optimal Illusions. Check it out, and I think it's got kind of two different target audiences. One that's going to welcome it from page one, and the others are the people who are going to resist it from page one. and and so I think both of them will enjoy it and certainly be stimulated by it. I appreciate you joining me. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Greg.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.